So at the moment, are you looking to raise?
Yes.
So let's say I'm an investor.
Yeah.
And we're having coffee. How much are you asking for?
How much am I asking for right now? What I would say if you're an investor across for coffee is this is the time to get into the language AI space, because all other elements that support ecosystem growth have already happened. So global tech has validated that low resource languages are the next frontier, right? And we need more data for that. We need contextualized models for that. So there are going to be multiple winners within this space.
So while global technology giants often overlook the linguistic diversity of the African continent, Chido and her team are building a foundational infrastructure to close the digital language gap. Founded in 2023, Vambo AI is a pioneering multilingual generative AI platform designed to translate, transcribe, and generate content across 44 African languages and 20 global languages. Is that correct? Wow. Correct. Through their flagship consumer app, Vambo Translate, and their developer-focused API platform, they are enabling businesses, educators, and communities to communicate seamlessly in native languages. With over 17,000 B2C users, early B2B traction, and $110,000 secured in a prestigious equity-free grants, including the Mandela Rhodes Foundation's ANIT Prize.
Yes.
Is that what it's called?
Correct.
Wow. Chido is proving that local language technology is a massive, untapped commercial frontier. Chido, it's an awesome pleasure to chat to you, and welcome to Impact Economix. That's a lot. That's a mouthful at such a short space of time. I think let's start. What is Vambo AI from your perspective? If you could give us an elevator pitch.
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me. Vambo AI, as you said, is a language infrastructure company. And pretty much what we're doing is building the rails of language so that anyone else who wants to build in the space of AI can build with inclusive technologies, and they aren't really restricted by that very important aspect, which is language, how we all communicate and how we understand anything in our lives.
And so how did the idea come about? How did you put it together? Is this your brainchild? What were the problems that you were seeing that you were trying to solve using AI specifically?
Yeah. Well, the work that we're doing today definitely evolved. The initial brainchild was a language learning company that I started during my gap year in 2019 when I was looking for work. And I think as the world was shifting, as we all went through the pandemic, and as technology really started taking center stage, we started rethinking the problem that we're trying to solve, which was language accessibility and availability, and starting to actually understand that language wasn't just about communicating or about being able to read certain texts in another language. It was actually an enabler for people to actually participate in what was going to become the AI revolution, which we now know today. So yeah, I won't say that this was something we sat down, like we're going to build it like this. It just came from us being in the field, in the tech space, building, seeing some of the trends that are changing and trying to align with that so that we can keep up with global trends.
Very interesting. I think my follow-up question, which will launch us to this conversation today, is, where LLMs, right, large language models, are notoriously sort of like inefficient at processing non-European languages, and often require significantly more tokens and therefore higher compute costs to process a single sentence, especially, for example, right, in languages like isiZulu, which is a South African language, Chisona, which is a Zimbabwean language, or Yoruba, which is a Nigerian language.
Yeah.
How has Vambo AI architected its underlying models or pre-processing pipelines to bypass this tokenization tax? Because it's a big conversation right now happening in the Western world and in Europe. and to keep interference costs economically viable for an African market. How have you worked around that?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. We found, I want to say found because, but we found that the tax on African consumers of AI is not just that tokenization tax. There's the correction tax, there's the localization tax, contextualization tax. And at some point, you just get tired of saying, why am I having to be the consumer that has to overcorrect myself just to use this type of technology to work for me? And again, that serves as one of the underlying missions as to why we want to build African models that cater to, again, African morphology. And the tokenization tax comes from the fact that these foundational models, their default is English or other world languages that aren't widely spoken here. So you'll find that, I'll use English as an example. One word in English could take like 1 token, but the equivalent of that takes 5 or 6 tokens in African languages. You mentioned Shona and Yoruba. Those 2 languages in particular, in addition to others on the African continent, have a respect form. So one sentence is said differently to an elder versus to a peer. Other languages even have gendered forms. So you can have almost 4 different versions for your elders, female, So there are just so many nuances that are not catered for in frontier models. And again, at some point, you just have to say, look, we can't keep trying to fine tune ourselves and our experience to this. We actually do need our own foundational model. And it's not to say that it's not worthwhile to still use frontier models. They are frontier models for a reason. But then there needs to be an element of inclusivity, especially around language, and languages that, or rather, foundations that cater to these nuances of the languages that we speak.
That's so interesting. I have a lot of thoughts on that. But for now, I want to understand, when you build a robust NLP solution, right, it requires massive, high-quality data sets. And like you were saying, many African languages are classified as low resource, like online. So to train a platform like Vambo AI, how did you solve that cold start data problem? Are you relying on proprietary data sets, synthetic data generation, or unique community-sourced feedback loops? And how do you protect against the data degradation in that sense?
Yeah, so many good questions you have. So I'll start by saying that, yes, we do use the open source data because it at least gives us a foundation to know what is available and what's not. I think a lot of what's happening now, especially on the African continent, is that certain languages have had more investment than others. So you'll find that Kiswahili, there's so much data and across different capabilities. There's data for language detection, there's data for ASR, there's data for translation. But maybe a language in another part of the continent hasn't had that much investment. So we have to first look at the resources that are available to be able to decide which ones are we going to invest in for our data collection.
Right.
Second to that, we do have our own internal data collection pipeline, which includes on-the-ground humans collecting data, validating data. And it's a lot of work. And I think initially when we started in our earlier days, we're like, okay, we want to do all South African languages. Let's just collect data for everything. But that wasn't the most strategic decision at the time. Yes, it allowed us to have more data in those languages, but we hadn't yet validated the use cases for those languages. Okay. So you'd find that perhaps, let's take, what example can I give? Because all languages. So you could find like one particular language may have more use cases in the healthcare space. So we need to actually focus on collecting healthcare or health sector related, words, vocabulary, etc., phrases, whereas another language is maybe more heavy in education or financial services. So we did have to take a step back and understand, again, where is this language primarily used? And the reason why there are also those differences is because a lot of our countries use English as the default language for economic and educational advancement. So again, not all languages are then equal. So in addition to the open source data, we have our own data pipelines, and then we have partnerships, which are extremely, extremely important. We cannot accurately validate things like dialects, things like new vocabularies without a linguistics department on the ground who are constantly, working through some of these challenges. I'll give you an example. We did a project where we were doing a translation for a company that wanted to offer cryptocurrency training to their community. How do you say cryptocurrency in isiZulu?
Oh my word.
Right? And it's things like that where we had to go back to our partners, the linguists, and say, are you able to find us an equivalent word or phrase to communicate this term to these people? And yeah, it becomes a bit of a longer process, but it's extremely important because then once we get all those ticks, we know that whatever model we're training on the other side is going to be accurate, contextually relevant, and anyone can use it, whether they are speaking this dialect, whether they're from this region, or even if they're code switching, the model will be able to pick that up and give them a satisfactory answer.
That is impressive. So what you're explaining, is deep context, right?
Yes.
And African languages rely a lot on context and nuance.
Most definitely.
And idiomatic expressions. And there's also tone and there's cultural metaphors. So from a product engineering perspective, how does then Vambo AI benchmark its models to ensure that cultural nuance and localized sentiment are accurately preserved rather than just providing a direct grammatical version? As you said, you have people on the ground who are constantly, collecting the data and aligning it correctly. But is there a more mechanized or automated way that this can be done?
Yes. So I think there are leading global benchmarks like the Blue benchmark, where, we also do assess our models against that. But at times, you'll find that those benchmarks are much better suited for translation use cases. And again, with African language, or rather the language infrastructure that we want to build, we don't want it to just end up being a translation tool where you put in a word or phrase and you get in the equivalent. We want it to also capture, like you're saying, the intonations, the actual context of what is being said. One phrase can be said by two different people, and in one case, it's an insult, in another case, it's a compliment. And we want to be able to capture that. So we have actually been doing a lot of research around creating new benchmarks with other partners that are within this NLP space and focusing on African languages. And I think eventually that's what we're going to have to also invest in as an ecosystem, creating our own frameworks, our own benchmarks, because again, the languages that we speak, the cultures and the communities that we represent are different. And not different in a way that's like inaccessible, just different in a way that it needs its own infrastructure across the board. So yeah, I'd say that what needs to be done is for us to just create our own frameworks and benchmarks and to start assessing all the solutions that are coming out based on that to build the credibility around it. But the other thing that I think, if someone kind of wants a quick answer, is just give it to a native speaker. If a native speaker sees it and they're like, what? What do you mean? It sounds like my grandmother. Then you're doing something right.
Interesting. Would it get to a point where, with the frontier models, where sort of like African words or African names, it does that red mark? Will you eventually get to a point where, you essentially democratize African languages to a point where it's like normal to say a word and it will instantly pick it up and not flag it as some typo, essentially?
No, definitely. And, that actually can happen right now, right? Because it's just kind of a setting that you give to a machine to say, recognize this word as a name or as a noun or as a verb, whatever the case is. I think the extra work we need to do, especially for African languages, is to then teach these machines that, okay, this is a Nguni word, right? Like I'll take Bona. Bona is a Nguni word, but it's also a Bantu word, and Bantu language is spoken all across Southern and East Africa. So when you see it in a Kiswahili sentence or Shona sentence or whatever, don't mark it as wrong. And I think, again, those are the additional deeper steps we need to take that, sorry, I actually literally just thought of so many things.
Yeah.
But for example, if we're training models on South African languages, it's fantastic, right? But again, they're Bantu languages that in the neighboring countries, there are a lot of similarities, similar words that are shared. So you can't look at it as I'm training for South African languages. It has to be I'm training Nguni languages, I'm training Bantu languages, and work on it through groups like that so that you can actually cover all the nuances that are related to those particular words those particular sentence structures, and then the vocabulary that has evolved with slang that has come up with the modern use of that language.
Would you describe your technology as disruptive in the sense that, against a widely spoken language like, English, and where a lot of African countries, also speak English, you are now offering an alternative. Well, it's not even an alternative, an African authentic, NLP that gives African languages their own authority in linguistics and in the broader sort of like understanding and in interaction of like languages.
Yeah.
How would you say you are disrupting the market, so to speak?
So I wouldn't say we're disruptive, actually.
Yeah.
I'd say we're more additive. So we are giving the community an additional way to interface, interact, create, contribute with something that's already existing and working well. And I think that's something I always actually like to share, that we're not saying don't use English or don't speak French, or we're just saying that you as an individual are not just an English speaker. You probably have an indigenous language that you are fluent in, and you're probably exposed to at least 2 or 3 other languages within the space of a year. It's not just English that you're speaking or being, or receiving information in. So why not allow you to have a natural experience in all the languages that you interface in? Whether that eventually becomes, let's say, your newspaper agencies plugging in our API, and now you can read your news in the 3 languages that you're interested in, your native, your English, and perhaps one that you're learning. Or that being, you traveling and suddenly not needing to learn a few words. You can actually just speak what you're speaking, but the other person on the other side is hearing because, it's able to also understand what they know. So I think that's what has also allowed us to then evolve to come to this space being an infrastructure company, not just a product. If it was a product, then perhaps it's trying to disrupt a particular niche in a particular market. But at that infrastructure level, again, you're building a road, you're building a bridge, and bridges only work to add access to other areas and territories that maybe you didn't have before.
Very interesting. And if we're talking about African markets, right? Internet essentially is kind of, understood as like platforms like WhatsApp, for example. And data costs are sometimes a major barrier to app adoption. How heavily did the infrastructure constraints dictate your product design? And how does your product market fit strategy change when deploying AI via lightweight APIs or chat interfaces compared to traditional web applications?
So I think for starters, we had to decide what type of infrastructure did we need to, one, train the right types of models and host them sustainably. And remember, our training pipeline doesn't start when we're actually training the model, it starts when we're collecting the data. So how do we make it easier for our data collectors to collect this data and to save it and to be able to do it offline? If they're in a rural village somewhere in Kenya, they shouldn't now need to buy data in order to have that. So I think we definitely had to start thinking around some of these mobile infrastructure issues quite early on. And basically creating offline versions of everything that we have an online capability for was a really good way to do that. Once we started trying to understand how users would use this offline, again, we had to think around the use case area. It's no use for me to just say, here's a great model. It's a small language model, so it can fit on your phone. But, what am I using it for exactly on my phone? And we had to actually do a bit of a research exercise to say, what are Africans doing on their phone? And aside from communicating or texting with social media platforms, they're doing transactions, either through mobile money or internet banking. Is there a fit for us directly in those 2 spaces? No, there isn't. But for us to actually be able to serve customers in that way, we are now serving the banks, or we're serving the telcos, or we're serving the social media platforms or anyone who has that channel. And we then don't need to then build infrastructure around that. We end up building infrastructure for that business that we're working with. That is what then led us to say, okay, we don't need the offline versions because we're not going to the end customer. What we actually need is small language models that are contextual for these clients that we have. So you'll find that perhaps if we're serving a telco that operates in Southern Africa, the small language model has to have Southern African languages and dialects and contexts and glossaries and everything. And that's how we've then evolved our solution to kind of fit the various use cases rather than to just create something that's offline, but we actually don't know who it's for, who's using it, how to track it, how to improve it.
Yeah. And speaking about understanding, the customer, of the 17,000 that you've reached so far, where's your highest traction? Where are you seeing, the market validation and the demand?
Yeah. So that number has actually gone up. And that 17,000 was primarily in the education space in South Africa. So that was for our EdTech-based solution, Vambo AI, where we allow secondary school students to access learning material and also engage with it in the indigenous languages. That was primarily just an education use case. And numbers for that are growing. And I think primarily because the students that we engaged hadn't yet been in a space where they could read their notes in English and Zulu at the same time.
Okay.
So starting to kind of understand what additional resources can do for them really drove up that user base. But in terms of where we're seeing a lot of activity, I think really in the developer space. So right now there's a huge demand for AI-powered or AI-based solutions. And having them localized it's just kind of like a standard requirement right now. So a lot of developers want the API, whether it's tokens for speech capabilities or for these two languages in their region or a pure translation layer. A lot of different solutions are coming, but the needs are the same, which is just the language capabilities.
Speaking about that sort of like demand and interest, initial trial rates often when it comes to user retention, they're often, deceptively high due to curiosity. But the churn can be brutal at the same time. Yeah. So what specific user retention metrics do you obsess over internally to prove that Vambo AI is embedded into your users' daily workflow rather than being treated as a one-off experiment?
Yeah, again, very good question. So again, when we started with the B2C platform. And I think really that was also just to try and align to the way that the global kind of generative AI ecosystem was developing. You have your ChatGPT, people are using that, and then the other B2B products developed after that.
Right.
But in Africa, it's a bit different because we need to target the paying customers first, and that's your businesses, not your consumers. Yeah. So when we were targeting the consumers, and for anyone who does have the capacity to service consumers, your kind of North Star metrics are like how many times did this user return and translate. But for us at that B2B level, or rather at the infrastructure level, our North Star metric is now kind of number of words translated.
Yeah.
And yes, I use translation loosely because it's not just that one capability. It's everything, whether it's the language detection or whether it's the ASR, but it's how much content are we actually allowing someone to localize now? Because you'll find that one user, perhaps again, they want to translate their website. That's a once-off. Once they've translated it into French, they're not going to keep coming back.
Yeah.
But then you might find another user who translates a book and they're like, oh no, this works really well. So all my publishing content, let me just take it through this platform. And that's how we know that we're actually driving value and allowing them to kind of use it well. And then second to the content is the number of languages that a single user is able to localize. So sometimes a user just has a need for one language. And again, there's a certain category for that within our camp. But then other times, once a user sees how well something works in the one language that they speak or that they needed, they often start finding other opportunities around other languages to provide that. And I think that's actually one of the most economically empowering things that we've seen about our platform, that someone just wanted to create, a chatbot for Uganda, but then immediately they're like, no, I can do this for South Sudan as well. And starting to see that expansion now happening faster than it traditionally did before language capabilities were available.
So across the African countries, how fast is your growth and expansion? If you were to quantify, where you are currently.
Yeah. So physically, we're in South Africa and Kenya. Our languages span across 21 African countries. We can't really count how fast our growth is because, again, users come from everywhere. So sometimes we've got a user from Canada who wants Hausa, or a user from India who wants Kiswahili. So for us, we just kind of try to understand which are our top performing languages, where are they performing, and again, which use cases are they performing best in, and then invest resources to keep those streams sustainable while we explore the other languages. Because at times, someone may just not know that, Wolof AI is now available, but we're not based in Senegal, and we're not doing that go-to-market actively. But then when someone then finds and says, oh, you guys have Wolof, what? Now we suddenly have to also pick up on being able to invest in that language a bit more, invest in understanding it and the other markets that, would want to commercialize or pay for that language.
Wow. I want to talk about investments and the startup landscape in South Africa and maybe in broader Africa. But before we get to that part, I'm just interested because one of the common hurdles with modern AI startups is proving that they aren't just an an API wrapper for, the frontier companies like OpenAI or Anthropic. So when sitting across an institutional investor, for example, how do you articulate Vambo AI's proprietary IP, its defensive moat, and the long-term tech stack independence?
A very good question. I think it depends on what you're really building for. So if you're building at the infrastructure level, of course, my tech stack is going to look vastly different to someone who's serving a particular use case. And I'll give you an example with us. So we build at the infrastructure level. We use our own APIs. But then when we became an impact grant winner for Meta, we needed to build a solution that included Llama 3.3, one of their foundational models. And that was essentially what's called a wrapper, right? But it was serving a particular case. And we were transparent to say this solution is a wrapper serving this sector, and it uses our API for these certain languages. So I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. And I think investors shouldn't look at wrappers as, something like if you hear a company's using a wrapper for a particular solution, it's a big no. It's a very cost-effective way to do a proof of concept because, again, inference is extremely expensive. So you would rather have a POC that you can afford, get your proof points, know how to get your traction before you make that larger investment of training your own models. And then I think in terms of then proving how is this not another wrapper, we've had to invest in having an open source strategy. So open sourcing some of our data sets, whether it's our synthetic data sets or kind of our human validated data sets, open sourcing some of our models as well. It doesn't move as fast as our closed source strategy, of course, because we have to be quite strategic about what that looks like and how it kind of positions us in the market.
Yeah.
But I think it really creates that sense of credibility where people can say, oh, okay, you open source one of your models. I can see that this is your work and there's no wrapper behind this. Yes, then I can believe that what you do have as your proprietary models is likely something of this nature as well.
Okay. Now, let's talk about investments. It's an interesting conversation. I mean, in terms of where you are, your growth, and the funding, sort of like a model that we see in Africa. how has your experience been like, raising capital? I mean, you started off with non-dilutive, grants, which is very impressive.
Yeah.
But as you continue to grow, you're going to need some capital injection.
Yeah.
How have those conversations been like? I mean, when you speak to investors, like now, like, what do you say?
Like, what's the pitch?
Yeah. What's the pitch?
So I think we were definitely fortunate to secure non-dilutive grant funding. And I'm really grateful for that, for every single funder that has backed us in that way, because it allowed us to actually truly understand the market and, again, where the commercial opportunities are. When we started, our pitch was we need to democratize, like language infrastructure for African languages. And that is still very important. But an investor wants to know what the commercial value is. And we didn't have that information yet. We didn't know, again, the use cases that are commercially viable and sustainable. We didn't know what the competitive landscape was going to evolve into. So I think we initially struggled to fundraise a lot. But I think it was because we didn't know enough, and the investors also didn't know because it was such a new market globally, let alone in Africa. And I think now the pitch has definitely evolved. I can pinpoint, I can tell someone where the money is, and I can tell them where the money is going to go in the next 5 years. But I can also tell them which gaps are being closed super quickly, So things like data collection, there are a lot of data collection efforts around the continent, and a lot of that data is being open sourced as well. So if they're funding a particular company on the premise of data collection only, it may not give them the returns that they want. But if they are funding a company that has managed to figure out, how do I get users to adopt this technology? After that, how do I get users to pay for this technology that they've adopted? And how do they then also get additional users across the world who are going to acquire this technology?
Yeah.
I think right now with the space of AI, because there are so many different solutions that are being built, we're finding that a lot of the ones that are lasting longer or having promise of long-term success are ones that can actually find the right places to collaborate with, either through acquisition or long-term partnerships. So that's kind of what our pitch has evolved into. Fundraising is still tough. I think generally as a tech founder, fundraising is just a very challenging part of the process. And I think also with this particular space, fundraising for compute, which is the key resource that you need, is also something that you have to be quite strategic about.
So at the moment, are you looking to raise?
Yes.
So let's say I'm an investor.
Yeah.
And we're having coffee. How much are you asking for?
How much am I asking for right now? I don't know if I'd like to say that on a podcast. But what I would say, if you're an investor across for coffee, is this is the time to get into the language AI space, because all other elements that support ecosystem growth have already happened. So global tech has validated that low resource languages are the next frontier, right? And we need more data for that. We need contextualized models for that. So there are going to be multiple winners within this space. I'd also pick a particular region that you deeply believe in, because again, that's where your commercialized use cases come from. So if you are focused on Southern Africa, bet on a Southern African company, conquer the region, move on to the next one. If you don't come and invest and give the money, we won't be able to do that. Or someone else from outside the continent will back us. And then again, we won't then really know how far that technology can go. And I think in terms of monetary value, because I know a lot of people do ask me this, like, how much should I be fundraising for to build something in AI? I think no less than $1 million. And again, primarily because that compute cost is very high. Yeah. You may be able to get credits or get some support, and that's fantastic, especially for model development. But inference, if your model or your solution blows up and you now have 10,000 Africans using it on a daily basis, the last thing you want to do is to switch that off because you can't afford the inference. So yeah, I'd say for any investor who's looking to join any team, $1 million is kind of what's sustainable for development over 12 to 18 months.
Okay. So speaking about that, there's something I want to show you. So, a lot of sort of like startups, get bogged down, sort of like before they get to the due diligence room or the data room. And I mean, you have experience, with these sort of like situations. So what you're looking at here is a proprietary terminal called Impact Economix. It's essentially going to be launching soon. It's still a a prototype. So what we're trying to solve here is a sort of like a funding mismatch or a lack of communication between founders and investors.
Yeah.
So at your level, how would you categorize yourself? Are you pre-seed, Series A founder?
Pre-seed, we've never raised.
You've never raised. Wow. So what if you were introduced to a terminal like this as a founder, what would you sort of like expect to be asked? And because this calculates what we call an operational resilience score.
Yeah.
So it gives you a solvency score that will tell you based on, the information that you put in, essentially where you stand in terms of resilience and risk. So essentially, what I want us to try is I'm just going to put some demo numbers and see how Vambo AI scores.
Okay.
And basically, if you're a founder, I mean, what are you sort of like anticipating in preparation for investment? Because I think a lot of tech founders or other startup founders don't know what to do. So I think if it comes from another founder, it could be of value.
Yeah. No, that's really exciting. I saw some things that I definitely grapple with, like SARS, Papia. So already I'm quite excited. I think for me, like I said, we've never raised VC funding, but we've raised over $300,000 in grant funding. And I think something that is very useful for platforms like this is to say, okay, if they've raised a different type of funding before, what was the impact of that or what came out of that? Because, I think that can then give an investor a bit of a better idea of how we use funds and what types of returns they can then expect, because we've already proven that we can manage funds and generate some sort of return.
Okay.
So I think that would be a good starting point.
So, for example, you say you've raised 300,000 in grant funding, essentially US dollars.
Yes.
That's about in rands. That's three bars.
Yeah, just
Plus. That's a lot. That's a lot
What's
of
the
money.
exchange rate? I don't know.
It's probably kind of double that, actually. That's a lot of money. Okay. Wow. Okay, cool. And how much money would you say, let's say, for tokens do you spend a month, roughly?
Ooh, that is a good question. It depends if we're just doing model development or. Okay, I think put it. I'll go a bit more on the higher end.
Okay.
So say $5,000 a month.
$5,000. Okay, I'm gonna convert this to rands. Okay, And then, how long have you been operating for?
3 years, but I'd say 2. The first one was research and development.
Okay, so I'll say 24 months. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Let's see if we can get something. So essentially, we are now doing a scan of your business and see if it will calculate an operational risk score based on the information you have given us. So you have received a score of 71%.
Okay.
Now, this is very basic because we haven't validated with CIPC, SARS, BE, and bank statements. Yes.
Yeah.
So the more you feed it with information, then the higher the score.
Okay.
And essentially, it validates your compliance. It passes through all the data to ensure accuracy, prevent it and check for any, misalignment or fraud. And the idea is that you walk away essentially with a validated operational resilience score that you can use as well. Because then once you get the certificate, it then breaks down what you need at basic level in order for you to qualify to just, be able to meet with an investor. And there's also a pathway for you to be basically inputted into the deal flow pipeline.
Okay.
So
is 71 good or like?
It's good. It's good. I suspect it could be actually 90. It's just that we don't have the actual documents. So this is just based on now the numerical calculations you've given based on how you are financially.
I think that would be really useful because again, I think some of the kind of elements of running an AI startup are like new to the ecosystem. So again, compute costs, data collection, pipeline costs, et cetera, et cetera. So I think this would be quite interesting, to be able to add all those nuances, but then communicate the end result in a way that an investor or a financial operator can understand. Yeah, they may not know exactly like, okay, how much does she really need for inference? But once I put everything in, another system says, okay, what she's saying does make sense. Given the scale that they're at, they do need this much. I think sounds good.
So you'd be willing to try?
No, definitely. I think for us, any additional frameworks that help us validate what we're doing and communicate the message are really useful. Someone can understand the mission, they can see the numbers, but if they can also see that, no, this is a viable business and this is sustainable and this can become something bigger, that would be really good for both fundraising, but even just working and motivating people to back the mission.
And my last question to that, to backing the mission, are you looking to branch out of the continent in terms of, sort of like setting up like shop and expansion? What is the growth trajectory looking like for you at the moment as you are looking to raise at pre-seed, which is a big deal?
It is.
And congratulations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
There's just so much work to do on the continent, so many languages that aren't yet where they need to be. But I think we were introduced to some really interesting colleagues that are doing work around low resource infrastructure for other countries. So I think on that foundational level of building low resource infrastructure that can be applied for the languages of South America or Southeast Asia or India, that'll be something we can definitely look into because it doesn't take us away from, our core mission of serving Africa. And while we're at it, again, still trying to get that commercial value for other languages to also be realized. And I think, definitely in terms of our long-term vision, we want it to be possible for any African across the continent to gain economic value from their mother tongue in the same way that, people in Europe, Italy, Hungary speak their native languages and are able to progress economically and educationally in that way. We want the same for Africans. And I think we are going to kind of stick to that primarily.
Fantastic. Well, Chido, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. And I wish you and the team at Vambo all the best as you look for funding. Have you gotten any interest from South Africa? Have you spoken to any VCs?
Yeah, no, definitely. We do have kind of like a network of VCs that we are kind of talking to and trying to find alignment for this next stage of our growth. So hopefully soon there'll be some exciting announcements.
That's nice.
But I think until then we keep working.